Conclusion. Quote, "The fact is, the assumptions upon which modern man and woman base their sense of meaning, purpose, and direction in the world is false. Not just partially false, but 100% false. Progress, science, and technology have not resulted in greater order and value in the world, but their opposite. This is not a purely philosophical or sociological observation. The modern world completely and utterly contradicts the second major law of thermodynamics, a law which has guided the entire age of physics. Like a giant blind spot, we have refused to understand the profound implications of this law, even as we have selectively applied it in order to create the modern technological society." End quote. Jeremy Rifkin. The quote-unquote entropy law is simply the latest and most scientific sounding of Satan's blueprints for Christ's defeat in history. It is indicative of the crisis in the Christian worldview today that so many Bible-believing, well-educated Christians have taken seriously a whole series of misuses of the legitimate concept of entropy. What is desperately needed today to restore Christians' confidence in the future of the church and also to reconstruct science in terms of a consistent Christian worldview is a new reformation. This reformation must be based on 5 principles: the doctrine of the absolute sovereignty of God, God's hierarchical covenants, biblical law, Van Til's presuppositional apologetic method, and optimism about the long-run earthly future. What is also needed is a new scientific paradigm based on this new reformation. This new reformation must be institutionally decentralized, confident about the church's role in history, orderly, and uncompromising. It must have its own agenda, its own blueprints for social reconstruction, and its own financing. It must break with radical apocalypticism, whether fundamentalist apocalypticism or New Age apocalypticism. It must be based self-consciously on the biblical concept of continuity in history. It must be based on the biblical idea of progress. It must fight ideas that are incorrect with something much better, a consistent biblical worldview. Any concept of science that is self-consciously Christian must begin with the creator-creature distinction. Man is made in God's image, and therefore he can think God's thoughts after him. Covenant-breaking man's mind is ethically fallen, but covenant-keeping people are given the mind of Christ. 1 Corinthians 2:16. This increase in the orderliness of man's mind is the product of ethical transformation through God's grace. It has nothing to do with any scientific law of entropy. This increase in clarity of vision is not matched by some increase in confusion elsewhere in the universe. The creation reflects the orderly character of God the Creator. The perceived disorder is in part the product of man's fallen mind and in part the product of God's curse of the world. But Christianity must proclaim the historical reality of Christ's resurrection and ascension. This resurrection leads in history to the progressive transformation and liberation of nature from God's curse, just as surely as the fall of Adam led in history to a discontinuous transformation and enslavement of nature. To preach the triumph of the curse is to deny the triumph of Christ at Calvary. To construct a methodology of science in terms of the historically irrevocable effects of the second law of thermodynamics is to ignore a fundamental doctrine of the Christian faith. This is precisely what Rifkin has done: denied the definitive, progressive, and final universe-transforming power of Christ's resurrection in history. Creation science has denied the definitive and progressive universe-transforming power of Christ's resurrection in history, although affirming the post-historic power of the resurrection. This denial of the power of the resurrection has rendered them intellectually incapable of successfully refuting Rifkin. Rifkin's appeal. Rifkin's appeal is to those Christians who have given up on the future, who have abandoned personal responsibility for working to bring the future under the covenantal reign of Christ. That appeal has been sporadically successful. There is a war on by the fundamentalist apocalyptists to defend their cherished cultural pessimism and their equally cherished apocalypticism. Rifkin is a self-conscious, humanistic accomplice of Christian quote-unquote pessimillennialists in this work of cultural erosion. He has added his cry of despair to the growing chorus of Christian despair concerning the diminishing effects of the gospel in history. He looks for the steady-state stagnation of socialism to delay the judgment. Pessimillennialists look for the physical return of Christ to speed up the judgment. They have all turned their backs on the idea of historical progress, one of Christianity's most valuable contributions to the West. In fact, one of the crucial foundations in the creation of the West. Rifkin has offered a worldview in the name of Western science, the second law of thermodynamics, that breaks with modern Western science, and especially Western technology. He has also offered this worldview in the name of a new, quote, Reformation Christianity, end quote, that breaks with Christianity. Rifkin argues that the coming changes in the world economy will produce a change in religion. Quote, the first Protestant Reformation will not outlive the economic age it grew up with, end quote. This argument is suspiciously similar to the old Marxist doctrine that religion is simply part of the ideological superstructure that is built on top of the true structure of society, the mode of production. Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto 1848, quote, what else does the history of ideas prove than that intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed? The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. Again, the mode of production in material life determines the general character of the social, political, and spiritual processes of life, end quote. Lo and behold, we find that the emerging order is divided into two sections. He titles Section 1, The Great Economic Transformation. He titles Section 2, The Religious Response. Rifkin scores initial points with conservative Christians by attacking liberalism. Liberalism is a dying philosophy in our day, he says. But his reason for saying this is based on his philosophy of economic determinism, one of 20th century liberalism's most precious creeds, taken from Marx. Quote, the twilight of liberalism is upon us, because the basis for liberal society no longer exists. Liberalism is founded on one overriding precondition, the possibility of unlimited economic growth, end quote. Here it is again, precondition. It is specifically an economic precondition. You know, as in economic substructure or mode of production. But historically, the argument is wrong. Classical liberalism preceded modern economic growth. It began to be formulated in the 17th century, especially by John Locke toward the end of the century. The Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Ferguson, David Hume, Adam Smith, etc., developed the premises of classical liberalism during the first 3/4 of the 18th century. Then, around 1780, after the fundamental tenets of classical liberalism were in place, the Industrial Revolution in Britain began. There was feedback between the ideology and the growing economy, just as there will always be feedback between covenantal law, covenantal faithfulness, and covenantal blessings, Deuteronomy 8:18. This hardly means that economic growth was dependent on the economic precondition of economic growth. If anything, it was the growing acceptance of the economic recommendations of classical liberalism that made possible the West's economic growth. What were the most important ideas of classical liberalism? They included these: the autonomy of the individual, the rule of law, the desirability of republican forms of government, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 20th century liberalism abandoned the classical liberals' faith in the free market economy and has added other doctrines supposedly more fundamental than the older ones: equality, the need for economic planning, the necessity of compulsory state education, secular humanism, the autonomy of the state from revealed religion, and the use of legislation as an instrument of social change, quote-unquote, salvation by law. But to single out economic growth as the foundation of liberalism is to stack the intellectual deck. To prove that he is no liberal, the heart of Rifkin's deception of conservative Christians, he calls liberalism into question by calling economic growth into question. He tries to separate himself from liberalism by writing a book against economic growth. Yet, in calling Christians to follow him in this supposedly anti-liberal intellectual reformation, he is calling on Christians to throw out one of the fundamental conclusions of Christianity, the doctrine of progress. Those Christians whose theological and especially eschatological presuppositions are implicitly or explicitly based on a rejection of the link between Christianity and historical progress, God's covenantal blessings in history, are intellectually hampered in challenging Rifkin. Rifkin versus progress. Consider his class analysis of the history of liberalism. Does it differ in any major respect from Marx's? Quote, "In essence, what the modern liberal is attempting to do is to take principles which were first enunciated over 300 years ago as the doctrine of a single class, the bourgeoisie, and extend them to all members of society." End quote. Why this accent on class philosophy? Why should such a concept be important in a book about the supposed New Reformation? Recall Marx's words introducing Part 1 of the Communist Manifesto. Quote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." End quote. 4 paragraphs later, Marx wrote, quote, "Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms." End quote. Rifkin says that he is against progress, especially technological progress. Quote, "The second law of thermodynamics, therefore, contradicts the modern notion of progress." End quote. He says that economic growth cannot go on much longer. He says that a new worldview will accompany this change in the economic substructure. There will be a new reformation. This reformation will bring with it ecological reform, land reform, more government-enforced economic equality, simpler lifestyles, and reduced per capita wealth. He says that men must realize at last that man is subject to nature, and not nature to man. In short, what Rifkin is opposed to is Western civilization in general and the Protestant work ethic in particular. Quote, "The Calvinist individual, who for hundreds of years sought salvation through productivity and the exploitation of nature, is now being challenged by a Christian person who seeks salvation by conserving and protecting God's creation. The Protestant work ethic is being replaced by the Protestant conservation ethic." End quote. Now we know who the enemy is. We are. Jeremy Rifkin spotted his targets, and he was able to pick off many of them, especially in the neo-evangelical Christian world, a world in which liberal-sounding rhetoric and cast-off humanistic intellectual fads have immediate appeal. But he has also appealed to some literate fundamentalists. How can this be? How can a self-professed New Age social theorist gain support from Bible-believing Christians for his radically pessimistic conclusions? First, he understood that their premillennial eschatology is inherently hostile to the idea of progress. His official worldview is also hostile to historical progress. If he is as dedicated to a Marxist view of history as he appears to be dedicated to the rhetoric of Marxist revolutionaries, then his official worldview is a sham. But perhaps he really does believe all the nonsense he writes about entropy and the decline of Western civilization. In either case, he is both dangerous and wrong. He recognized that he could appeal to an already existing mindset. Second, he recognized that the favorite intellectual defense of the creationist movement was based on the second law of thermodynamics. This provided him with a second tactical approach, the appeal to entropy. What could creationists say in response? That they really do believe in historical progress, progressive sanctification in history, despite their commitment to the second law as an intellectual weapon against the evolutionists? No, they have remained silent. They recognize that Rifkin's brand of socialism is wrong, but they have not been willing to scrap their own pessimistic eschatologies and their implicit acceptance of entropy as binding in social theory as well as in physical theory. They are even willing to cite Rifkin's views on entropy as if he were a representative and respectable humanistic social theorist, simply because of his commitment to entropy as an inescapable concept. Rifkin and the West's Failure of Nerve. What we are witnessing in the final decades of the 20th century is the social and religious phenomenon described by Gilbert Murray as the failure of nerve. Murray was describing the final centuries of classical Greece, but the phrase applies just as well to Western civilization today, in part because it is the spiritual and intellectual heir of humanistic Greek culture. By the time of Christ, this pessimism had combined with various apocalyptic visions of the imminent transformation of man and the cosmos. This vision of defeat affected members of the early church, not just the pagan Greeks and Romans. As David Chilton writes, quote, "The apocalyptists expressed themselves in unexplained and unintelligible symbols, and generally had no intention of making themselves really understood. Their writings abound in pessimism. No real progress is possible, nor will there be any victory for God and His people in history. We cannot even see God acting in history. All we know is that the world is getting worse and worse. The best we can do is hope for the end. Soon." End quote. This happened again 12 centuries later. J. Huizinga's study, The Waning of the Middle Ages, 1924, describes 14th century Northern Europe in terms of radical pessimism and also a belief in apocalyptic deliverance. It was the end of an era, speeded along by the devastation of bubonic plague after 1347. Generation after generation, the plague returned. The era was also marked by apocalyptic religious and revolutionary violence. The decline of medieval Europe was accompanied by the rise of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was deeply magical in its worldview, even though historians have long emphasized its rationalism and humanism. It was the product of a self-conscious imitation of classical civilization, which was also both rationalistic and occult. The Renaissance was supremely confident, even as Western humanist culture was until 1964, until the return of Columbus from the New World. Columbus's expedition brought back more than tales of a new world in 1493. It brought back syphilis, and this killer disease spread across Europe within 5 years. It had struck China by 1506 or 1507, less than 15 years after Columbus returned. It shook the foundation of Renaissance confidence. In 1517, 24 years after syphilis broke out in Europe, Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg. The Reformation began. Today we face AIDS. The confidence of Western humanism has already shown signs of fading. What little confidence that remains will be destroyed unless there is a near-term cure for AIDS, which is unlikely, according to medical researchers. Apocalypticism, visions of the end of the world, is today a common feature within American fundamentalism. Any theory of hope in the earthly future is rejected by modern Christian apocalyptists as some sort of humanist remnant of an older optimism, or New Age speculation, meaning humanist apocalypticism, the creation of a man-made New World Order. The pessimillennialists, by adhering to a vision of defeat, are unable to challenge successfully the Rifkins of this world, so they pretend that pessimistic New Agers do not exist, pretend that optimism is the philosophy of the New Age movement. Why? By ignoring their own shared pessimism with Rifkin, they find it easier to impose guilt by intellectual association on Orthodox Christians who proclaim victory in history in the name of the power of the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ in history. By linking the eschatology of premillennial dispensationalism to the Bible, and then by linking Christian optimism about the future with New Age humanism, Dave Hunt and Constance Cumby thereby have become self-conscious defenders of the New Agers' number one cultural principle, namely the external defeat of Christ's people in history. They have attempted to tar and feather Christian optimists with the charge of being naive fellow travelers with the New Age movement, when they themselves are equally vulnerable to the same accusation. This should lead us to conclude that there are pessimists and optimists in both camps, New Age and Christianity, and that a person's eschatology is self-contained, not influenced by the New Age movement. But a person's consistent conclusions concerning the implications of his eschatology can be misused by certain humanist groups. The defense of one's eschatology and its conclusions should be based on what the Bible says. and not on what hypothetical links there may be between this or that New Age group. Prying open a can of New Age paint to splatter on one's eschatological opponents only succeeds in getting a face full of paint in return. One thing is clear. Jeremy Rifkin is by far the most eloquent social philosopher of the New Age movement. No other figure has enjoyed anywhere near the number of book sales on as many different topics. For Mrs. Cumby and Mr. Hunt to ignore Rifkin's self-conscious attempt to pick off the premillennialists by means of his and their shared pessimism about the future, a pessimism proclaimed by Mrs. Cumby and especially Mr. Hunt, and then to try to link far more obscure New Age writers with the Christian Reconstruction movement's optimistic worldview is not simply unfair. It shows startling unconcern with the primary sources of the New Age movement's impact in popular thought and culture. Jeremy Rifkin is our problem, not Alice A. Bailey. If you have never heard of Alice A. Bailey, don't feel too bad. Neither has 99.999% of the U.S. book-buying population. Mrs. Cumby believes that the theological writings of the late Mrs. Bailey are the key that unlocks the secrets of the New Age movement, and she lists Mrs. Bailey's Lucis Trust first in her appendix, Selected New Age Organizations. I think Mrs. Bailey's theological writings are more like a key into a lunatic asylum if you read too much of them. Rifkin's books have an air of coherence and sanity about them, which is why he, and not Mrs. Bailey, has had considerable success in the Christian intellectual community. Conclusion. Even conclusions need conclusions sometimes. I asked 3 questions at the end of my introduction. 1. What is really fixed throughout world history? Natural law, ethical law, or both? 2. How are these 2 forms of God-given law related? 3. Is there a relationship between how mankind acts and how the world works? I said that because Christians are divided over the answers to these 3 questions. We face a crisis in the Christian worldview. We have already seen what this crisis is, a crisis in faith concerning the future. What are my answers to these 3 questions? First, it is the Bible-revealed law of God that is the constant in history, not physical laws. God providentially sustains His creation. He gives to mankind knowledge of the personal, social, and scientific laws necessary for mankind to exercise dominion. The moral laws, the 10 Commandments and the case laws, are constants in history. Laws of nature are also constants, but physical and biological laws can change. Let me give an example. Smallpox is communicated only from human to human. Once someone gets smallpox and recovers, he ceases to be a carrier. If he has an innate immunity to smallpox, he does not transmit the disease after his exposure to it. Thus, scientists have stamped out the disease by locating outbreaks of smallpox and rushing in to quarantine the victims and immunizing everyone in the vicinity. The spread of the disease is halted, for the germs die in their hosts and fail to be transmitted. Region by region, the germs are exterminated. This scientific strategy has worked. Except inside that one British laboratory, the smallpox species is gone. It is only because of the species' presently fixed epidemiological characteristics that it has been stamped out by science. This raises a very curious question. What about Noah's family? For 6 months, they were on the ark alone. How did smallpox germs survive this isolation period? How did the disease ever get started again? We know that it did, but our knowledge of how the disease is transmitted tells us that it should have been wiped out in the quarantine period on the ark. God has the power to preserve life or spread death by changing the way biological systems operate in any species. The quote-unquote laws of biology can change. We see an example of this in the Bible in the promise of God to eliminate biological miscarriages, Exodus 23:26. Those physical regularities that are farthest away from man's control, gravity, the speed of light, radiation, seem to change least. They point to limits on man. The more universal a law is in galactic scope, the less it is likely to change. But it is obvious to a 6-day creationist that the speed of light was not a constant during creation week. since billions of light years were not available for light to travel from the newly created stars, day 4, to the Earth. Thus, at best, that most constant of scientific constants, the speed of light, is a very recent constant. More recent, day 4, than the creation of the Earth, day 1. Constants are in all cases personal. God personally sustains them. He provides these covenantal regularities. Physical constants are far less important than moral constants. Man's successful dominion efforts are not based primarily on his knowledge of physical constants, but on his obedience to biblical constants. Second, God's personal covenant with mankind in general, and with Christians in particular, has established cause and effect relationships between the moral laws of God and so-called natural laws of the physical world. The cursed effects of entropy can be overcome by covenantal faithfulness to God, as revealed before men, angels, and God by means of personal obedience and Christian profession of faith. Man is given power to overcome the limitations of physical laws through knowledge, which in turn expands through covenantal faithfulness of a society. Ethics is closely related to knowledge. God grants the gift of knowledge to those who obey at least his external moral requirements. Finally, there is a relationship between how mankind acts and how the world works. World in its broadest sense, social, physical, and historical. We see this clearly revealed in Deuteronomy 28. For faithful societies, the world works to bless men, verses 1 through 14. In unfaithful societies, the reverse is true, verses 15 through 68. There are covenantal blessings and cursings. God, who governs all things, uses his creation to bless and curse individuals and societies. Thus, the emphasis on entropy as an inescapable, universal constant is misguided. Such an emphasis erroneously indicates that the processes of nature are in control of man and man's destiny, whereas the Bible clearly places man and the covenant above nature. Nature fights man or cooperates with man in terms of mankind's ethical battle against God or cooperation with God. This is the neglected lesson of Genesis 3. If mankind rebels against God, then nature will rebel against mankind. The covenantal relationship between man and God is primary. The covenantal relationship between man and nature is secondary. And the universal rule of physical entropy has meaning only in relation to the two prior covenantal relationships. It is time for the creation science movement to rethink its present use of the second law of thermodynamics. There are so many solid scientific arguments that can be used to torpedo the Darwinists that the eschatology of entropy should be dropped or drastically modified. It has caught the attention of so many laymen in the creationist movement only because it fits their pessimillennial worldview. The appeal to entropy has not served to persuade the evolutionists, and it has done much to reaffirm the prevailing pessimistic, defensive, world-retreating outlook of six-day creationists. It has produced far more harm than good, and Rifkin's perception of its value to him is proof enough of its liability to creationism. To elevate the appeal to entropy as the key argument in the scientific creationist movement is to hide the creationist lamp under a basket. I think the younger creation scientists recognize this. It is time for the six-day creation movement to look to the resurrection as the foundation of its worldview, not the curse of God in the garden. When this happens, we will also see a shift of eschatology. But that is as it should be. The Holy Spirit is alive and well on planet Earth.